In today's video, we're going to know why is everybody doing podcasts in 2025, who should do it, who should not. And after working on the podcast for more than 5 years now, I can tell these are the 10 reasons why every business, every consultant, coach, or even agencies are doing podcasts in 2025 and why you should too. First off, I think this is very obvious to tell, but it has a massive market growth and awareness opportunity. Like if you, according to a survey, by the way, I'm going to mention all the links that of the stats that I'm going to mentioning here in the description. You can check those out. So more than 150 million episodes published in 2025, more than 150 million episodes published. And there are over 4 million podcasts all over the globe, like 4 million podcasts. You tell by the numbers that this is so big. And the best part about it is that 55% of the Americans listens to the podcast on a monthly basis. 55%. This is a huge number. Like if you go towards the stats, in 2020, when the COVID happened, the number was 333 million. And that has grown to 504 million by the end of 2024. And now the number has crossed 584 million global listenership of the podcast. So you can tell the opportunity is huge, and this is one of the reasons why everybody is stepping into the podcast world. And as I've mentioned, out of the 584 million listeners, 55% of them are from United States. So, and this is the report from 2021 to 2024. As you can tell, United States, Sudan, Canada, Norway, Australia, Spain, UK, Mexico. These are some of the biggest markets for podcasts. Now, this is very important that podcasts should be worth listening to. Out of these 150 million episodes that are being published, it doesn't mean that all of them, get weekly or monthly listeners. There are a few podcasts, you can say a few thousand podcasts that people chose their interest into, and we all know podcasts like Joe Rogan, Diary of a CEO, and stuff like that. These are some of the podcasts that people chose interest in. We're going to later talk about should you do niche podcasts. That is a very new thing and very in trend these days, and that has more opportunity, I see, according to my perspective. Or should you do like journal podcasts like Diary of a CEO and Joe Rogan that covers anything and everything. So we're going to dive into this later in the video. The second reason I believe is that it has a huge revenue potential. Now, again, if you're a business, if you're a consultant, if you're a coach, this should not be the reason that you should start a podcast, but it doesn't mean that this is not one of the reasons. It is definitely a huge reason why people step into the podcast, because it's a $2 billion industry. And this is the revenue that, people have generated through the monetization and, the ad revenue and all that stuff. So whether or not you're a business or you're a consultant, your goal should be to start a podcast, to bring awareness, to create awareness. But this is for the fact that most of the biggest podcasts, they do generate a huge chunk of revenue. $2 billion. That's a huge number, as you can tell. Out of those, 46% of US listeners. So we're going to talk about the impact of these podcasts. 46% of US listeners make purchase after hearing an ad. There are two kind of ad. One monetary ad that people put the ads on your podcast, relevant ads on your podcast, and they sell. But there are second type of ads that you might never heard of, or you might have heard of, are the ad that you put by yourself in your video. For example, the podcast is with your guest, and in the middle of that you're going to add a section about your own offer, your own service, or someone you partner with. So this is a great way. Podcasts are a great way to market or advertise your services as well. And the third and the biggest step that I believe, the biggest reason that I believe in 2025 is that the AI tools, they have literally lowered the barrier to entry, meaning that there are so many tools these days, there's so many AI tools that has made podcasting very easily. Me being a podcast editor, my team and I, we use tons of AI tools on a daily basis that back in 2020 was very difficult to do. For example, I'm going to mention a tool named Autopod, By the way, not sponsored. Who else gonna sponsor me on 100 subscribers, by the way? Anyways, there is a tool called Autopod. So what it does is basically, if you have a podcast recorded in 3 camera angles, what it does is that it clips out the camera, it edits the cuts, it clip out the parts of the listeners automatically, sometimes even minutes, sometimes even seconds. You won't believe this. It just clip up the podcast, which back in 2020 or 2021, I believe, we used to do it manually. We listen to the podcast, we find out which camera angle should we put on the main screen, whether it's going to be the guest or it's going to be the host, or if the both parties were talking, or if the host is showing expression to whatever the guest is saying, we're gonna put a wide camera angle to it. Literally took hours for us to do it manually. But right now, AI has made things so much easier. So for those who are willing to start podcasts in 2025, AI has literally lowered the barrier to entry. So this is one of the reasons 40% of podcasters now use AI tools over their teams. Like, I've worked with so many teams, and one of the biggest thing we listen is that from finding the guest for their podcast, suitable guest for the podcast, to publishing the podcast, the whole journey, AI literally contributes around 40 to 50%. It covers the journey. So we can definitely tell in the 5 years how rapidly AI is, impacting our businesses. So there are a couple of more tools that can, literally help you to make the editing, transcripting, scripting, making promotional content for your podcast easy using tools like ChatGPT, TurboScribe, and Riverside and stuff like that. So one of the other reasons that I would like to quote here is that podcast listeners spend around 7 hours of consuming podcast content a week on average. So for example, 7 days a week, at least 1 hour, a podcast listener listens to a podcast on a weekly basis. 1 hour every day means 7 hours a week. So you can tell the opportunity is big, the barrier to entry is lower, which is also going to create more podcasts. But that doesn't mean that every podcast is going to stand out. For you to be able to stand out, you need to do a couple of things that I will make a separate video about. That what are the things that makes good podcast stand out, and you can watch that out later. But let's just move on to the next reason. So agree with me or not, but the short form content has contributed so much towards the podcast industry. Reason, in 2020 or even in 2021, 2022, I used to edit the podcast, but I was not myself a listener. How I became a listener? By watching the reels. Because there were so many podcasts at the time, but nobody was listening to it, at least not of my age. We were not listening to the podcast. How we got introduced to this was by watching reels on social media. That's how we got to find something that we can relate to. We want to, get to know more about it. So we go to the YouTube and watch the whole podcast. And this is how I myself personally got introduced to the podcast industry. Podcast is now my life, coffee and podcast. But you would agree with me that, and there are also stats, 70 to 75% of listeners listen to the podcast on smartphones, which means that mobile phone or the short form content has literally contributed towards the podcast industry. And as per the stats, you can tell that 70% of the listeners listen to the podcast on their mobile phones. And the biggest promotion is the short clips. Short clips are a great way to emphasize the impact of a podcast. If it sparks the curiosity, people definitely going to go towards the long form content, which is YouTube podcast or Apple or Spotify, and they're going to listen to the whole podcast. And that's what I do. That's what people of my age are doing. It's not even now any age thing. Gen Zs, millennials, everybody's listening to the podcast. Let's move on to the next reason, which is video podcasts and social media clips go viral. 31 to 33% of people leads towards the YouTube by these social media clips. So the video podcast has more engagement opportunities rather than audio podcasts. Back in 2020 or before that, people are doing podcasts, but their main focus was to do audio only podcasts, like on Spotify or Apple Podcasts and platforms like that. But the engagement has doubled ever since the video podcast has started. Because let's just agree, I would wanted to see the expressions of someone talking rather than just listening. I do believe that podcasts are good while you're driving or something like that. Like you don't have to focus or watch something. But to me, the experience of watching someone talking is more impactful, is more something that I could relate to, and would something I would want to. So the podcast, especially the video podcasts, have doubled the engagement around different platforms, and especially YouTube has given a huge opportunity, as we have discussed earlier, that most of the people they watch the video podcast rather than the audio only podcast. So it has a huge impact. Okay, now let's move on to the next part. It generates community and parasocial connection. So what do we mean by that? Agree with me or not, but the raw content has more connection towards the audience rather than a polished YouTube video. The reason why I'm doing this video in this style is because that it has pauses, it has the rawness, it's not polished, it's not finished. So people tend to watch more raw content because they want to know that what the process actually looks like, what the other person whom they are listening to, what is their perspective. Because a YouTube video or a social media reel is a very polished piece of content. Now people are reverting back, the trends are changing. People want to know the raw content, the raw emotions. By talking to someone for an hour or two, the host of the podcast, they spark something that triggers them emotionally in a good manner. So they speak heart to heart. They forget that this is being recorded. So people get to know their favorite person, or get to learn about their favorite personalities with the help of podcasts. And I think this is one of the reasons why podcasts are growing rapidly. The next point is political and creator influence, which you all agree that if you want to reach the younger audience, you gotta be on social media. And what could be a great way to do a podcast and get that repurposed into short reels and spread it across social media, and that would revert back to bringing audience onto your podcast. Agree with me or not, but the example of Kamala and Donald Trump is a great example here. The way they have increased their influence or younger audience through these podcasts and social media clips has been remarkable. So I think people really want to get recognized. They want to know socially, globally, they want to get recognized. So podcasts are a great way to influence people, to want to find the audience that relates to you. Let's move on to the next reason. Global reach and localization is one of the biggest reasons why podcasts are increasing. See, the non-English shows are rising. People used to consume English only content, but now they are podcasts that are very, very niche podcasts by the perspective of language, and also by the perspective of by the industry. So what do I mean by that? I have worked with the podcasts that were in a very specific language and were in a very specific niche. So let me give you an example. I used to work with a agency. They had a video podcast, and they used to do Dutch podcast, and they used to only target the fitness industry. So language target, and then the industry target. So it was a very niche podcast. So this trend is growing. They wanted to do marketing for the people that are their targeted audience, and that's one of the point that I've mentioned in the beginning of the video as well, that we're going to talk later, that what's been trending and what you should do. So if you're a business, if you're a local business and you wanted to target some specific audience that is in your area, that is into some specific thing, for example, into food, into marketing, into fitness, whatever the niche that you want to target to, start doing podcasts in that local area language, and talk to the people that are linked with that niche. For example, fitness in this scenario. Trust me, this is the next big thing that's coming in 2026. By the end of 2025, this trend is going to boom. I have also been a part of a couple of podcasts that were very niche, as I've mentioned. And this is one thing that if you are a coach, if you're a consultant, if you're a business owner, especially a business owner, and you're working locally and you have a very specific target audience, you should consider that specific language podcast and that specific niche podcast. This is very, very important. So moving on to the next reason is that monetization paths beyond ads. 66% offer paid content and 55% read their own ads. As I've mentioned earlier, that you can earn through the monetization, but you can put your own ads into it. So for example, let's just say this is the podcast that we are doing. It is in a similar format, but I've also talked about my experience into the podcast editing world and all that stuff. This is one of the way that I market my service and also create a connection with you and give you a sense that if you ever need a podcast editing service or stuff like that, you know whom you have once listened to. So this is one of the reasons that the podcast gives you endless opportunity to market yourself and your brand and your company. So the monetization paths are very wide. And finally, moving to the last reason, which is highly engaged audience behavior. What do we really mean by that is that listeners often finish episodes 80 to 90% and spend 35 plus minutes per session interactively, polls, live Q&A, chapter markers, and stuff like that. So on YouTube, there are now timestamps. 80 to 90% people, they finish their podcast according to a survey, and they spend around 35 plus minutes per session. So if a podcast is, let's say, about 1 hour, people are spending at least 35 plus minutes listening to the podcast. If this is relevant to them, if this is something that they would learn about something, so they're definitely gonna listen to it. According to the short form content, people don't have that much, attention span and stuff like that. So the long form content, especially the podcast, they're more relevant. We've talked the reason why it is, but this engagement behavior is one of the main reason that I believe that every business should do a podcast. You don't have to write fancy scripts. This is going to be very generic, very raw. You just have to sit in front of the camera, select a topic, invite a guest, and start talking about it. If it's in the industry that you are also targeting, the chances have increased that more people are going to listen to it, because they might not want to listen to you, but they might want to listen to your guest. And if it's in the same industry and you talk or you speak about it, they're 100% reason that you're going to discuss about your business. He's going to discuss about his business. So it's very beneficial for both of you, for your growth and for your expansion. And yeah, this is what I believe that you should do podcast in 2025. In the next episode or video, whatever you want to call it, we're going to talk about the tools that you can use to be able to start podcasting in 2025, or if you need my help with your podcast, if you are aiming to start a podcast, or if you need my help with it, I'm attaching my portfolio link in the description. You can check that out. And yeah, I'll see you in the next one. Take care. Bye-bye.